2.
Welcome to Orthodox Radio TV, and this show is very important because many Catholics believe they are being faithful if they only do traditionalism and go to certain chapels and move to go to certain schools. But many have been hoodwinked and are not in communion with Rome. Today's topic, we are going to cover what is Sedevacantism. Welcome again, Brother Alexis Bonolo from Rome. Welcome, brother.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Ordo Militaris Radio TV. It's always a pleasure. And this is an important topic because I'd say in the last 30 years, I can't say how many people I've run into who have told me that they're Sedevacantists.
Yeah. So let us begin with what is Sedevacantism?
Okay, Sedevacantism, you could describe many ways. Phenomenologically, we could say it's a chapel somewhere down the street from where you live. Like, for example, UAJ, they'll call themselves Catholic. They might call themselves traditionalists. They'll do the Latin Mass. And on questions of doctrine and morality, they probably represent faithfully everything that was before the church, although each group has its own variation because the Sedevacantists are not united among themselves. They split and divide and split. What is Sedevacantism? It is a group within the, I'd say within the Catholic Church that hold that that there is no Pope because the Pope personally is a heretic. However, they will tell you what is the criteria by which a Pope is a heretic, and they will make the accusation, and they will judge the case, and they will impose the penalty. So since the council, the popes, many popes, I think nearly all of them have said something that was strange, bizarre, or what many a Catholic would say doesn't sound Catholic to me. But in the Catholic Church, the distinction is this, that we have courts, we have lawyers, we have sentences of judgment, and we have more important, we have a hierarchy established by God. The Catholic Church is not a democracy. The Catholic Church isn't like a town in New England where if everyone gets together, they can pass a law. The Catholic Church is a monarchy with Christ as the head, and Christ never had any intention to give anyone authority to do anything outside of his sacred pastors. Okay. So every decision in the church is based on the decision of Christ, the apostles, the bishops they left for us. And in the Catholic Church, the Bishop of Rome has authority over the whole church in the sense that his duty is to confirm his brothers in the faith and guide them in the faith, and he has a special charism of to teach infallibly when settling questions of great importance for the church. And we call the Bishop of Rome the Pope, or the Roman Pontiff, the Patriarch of the West, or the Vicar of Christ, or the successor of St. Peter. Those are all his titles. Now, down through the centuries, there have been popes who have failed in their offices. There were popes in ancient times who, there was one pope who offered incense to demons, and the bishops gathered around from Latium and decided to question him about that, ask him to repent, or that he would be deposed, because if you're an idolater, you can't be Catholic. And he repented, and he went on to become a martyr. So there is an established procedure if the Pope should become a public sinner in matters of faith or religion. And it's always bishops who judge that matter. So the question if a Pope would lose office because he's a heretic or an idolater is a serious question. It's a possible question. It's not deniable. And when John Paul II went to Assisi and had prayers with all these religions at once, and Benedict did the same thing, when Bergoglio had people from South America perform satanic rituals in his presence and he participated, all these things have led many Catholics to be so scandalized that they easily fall into the thesis of the Sedevacantists in the sense of, well, he must be a heretic, and therefore he's not Pope, and therefore there's no Pope, and we can go set up our own church. But that's not a Catholic reaction. The Catholic reaction is, if serious public sin has been committed by someone, the Roman Pontiff, we urge the bishops to publicly reprove the Pope, and if he persists in his sin, then a council be called to give him a formal, legal opportunity to defend himself or repent, okay, after which he would be deposed, because if you're a heretic, you're not a member of the church, so not technically could be deposed, but his deposition be declared. If you are no longer Catholic, then obviously you're not a member of the church, and so the bishop would declare that. So the bishops have the authority to declare whether someone is a Catholic or not a Catholic. It's part of their apostolic authority. And inasmuch as a pope may no longer be a Catholic because of heresy or idolatry or schism, the bishops can declare that, and that's Catholic teaching. It has always been done. But it has never actually been done to a pope. It came very close in the case of that early pope I mentioned. His name escapes me. There was a similar case in 1046 when 3 men claimed to be the Pope of Rome, and Henry III of Germany, the German king, came down and held a council, a synod at Sutri, and all the clergy of the Diocese of Rome and the bishops of Central Italy came and heard the legal basis of the claims of these 3 men, and declared all 3 of them had no valid claim, and deposed them. Were they Pope? Well, insomuch as they claimed they were Pope, they were deposed. But they were not Pope because they didn't hold valid titles to the papacy. So that's the way of doing it. It's bishops who make these, and clergy who make these decisions. It's not lay people. Okay. So Sedevacantism is very appealing today because of all the scandals in the church, and that's why many Catholics go into it.
Okay. Who started this Sedevacantist religious movement?
Okay, so Sedevacantism as a thing was proposed, first of all, by an American, Francis Urquhart, I think that's how you pronounce his name, in 1967. He was a devout Catholic, very devoted to Our Lady, and has suffered a lot of illness. And with great faith in Our Lady, he attributed his cure of his illness to that. He was a big participant in the Blue Army of Our Lady of Fatima, a great movement to promote the devotion to Our Lady of Fatima. And then he went and founded a group up in Boise, Idaho. And a few years after that, he judged that Paul VI was a heretic and therefore no longer Pope. So he was the first in the United States to start the so-called idea that there is no Pope because of heresy. And he was an ex-seminarian, but he wasn't a theologian. He wasn't a canon lawyer. He didn't, as far as I know, base his arguments on canon law, and didn't ask Pope Paul VI to defend himself. And as far as I know, he didn't write bishops, but maybe he did. But from him comes the Fatima Crusader, the CMI group. Bishop Dolan, Father Dolan eventually gets associated with him. So he was like the arch Sedevacantist, arch in the sense of the first, in the Greek sense of the term, the one that started it off. He was a layman, deeply scandalized by what Paul VI was doing to the church. And I think most Catholics would say they were deeply scandalized what Paul VI was doing to the church. But there's a difference between a pope being a sinner and not being pope, okay? And there's a difference between a pope being a sinner and myself, deciding he's not the pope. 3 years later, there was a Japanese layman who started a group called Seibu no Mikuni, and his name was Yukio Nemoto, and he said that Paul VI wasn't Pope either. And then there was a group of Jesuits in Mexico, led by Father Joaquin Sanz Arriaga, who claimed that Paul VI was setting up a heretical church, and it was no longer the Catholic Church. And then there's all different kinds of variations. There was the Dominican theologian, Father Michel Louis Gerard de Lauriers, probably the most eminent of all those we'll name today. He was an advisor to Pius XII for the definition of the Assumption of Our Lady. he was a Dominican, a very learned theologian, and though at first, as a professor in the seminary St. Pius X, he said that Paul VI is no longer a pope because of heresy. He modified his opinion slightly into a thing called Sedevacantism, where on account of heresy, a pope is still pope, but he doesn't have the authority of pope. And then there was a group of priests, Father Daniel Dolan, Anthony Cicada, Donald Sanborn, who broke from the Society of St. Pius X in the United States in the mid-70s and took the position of Sedevacantists. Each of them went on to be quite noteworthy. Father Anthony Cicada, I'd say, is probably one of the most famous of them as a controversialist and as a scholar and as a debater, although he will always skirt the issue here and there and on things like that. But he published a lot of material, Father Cicada, and I think of all of them had a reputation of being an intellectual or an academic. They were expelled by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who was not a Sedevacantist. He expelled them from the society, and then they went off on their own. Father Dolan and I think Sanborn went on to Father Dolan went on to get ordained a bishop by some of the group. Another famous Sedevacantist, at least it's said here in this article I'm reading, Father Gomar de Port. I didn't know if he was a Sedevacantist, but he was actually a parity at Vatican II, and he actually got support from the hierarchy once he made his decision. Bishop of Tivoli, or the apostolic nuncio, and one of the apostolic delegates in China. But he never founded an organization. He just set up a small chapel there and up the river from New York City, and he's famous for his radio programs for many years. He died in 2005, and as far as I know, everyone speaks well of him. He was a seminary professor in Baltimore, and I've talked to some of his followers. They claim he was the really first to start the traditionalist movement in the United States, because all this was back in the 60s or 64, 65, those years. Then there's Father Oswald Baker from England, the American missionary Capuchin, Father Lucian Pulvermarker, who was a missionary in Japan. When he came back in the 70s to the United States and saw how crazy everything was, he just dumped the American church, and he ended up in a group which believed that they could elect the Pope without being part of the Roman Church, and they elected him the Pope. I actually met one of Father Pulvermarker's brothers, who was also a Capuchin, who thought he was a little exaggerated in his conclusions and things. So those were the early components of it. Obviously, once you accept the idea that there is no Pope, how do you get the sacraments? So the problem with these groups is then they try to figure out how we're going to get someone in our group ordained a bishop so we can have priests and the sacraments and continue the church as our own little private, business or things like that. So one of the most instrumental figures is Archbishop Nung Dinh Thuc, who was a Catholic archbishop from Vietnam. And after Vietnam fell, he traveled the West, and he ordained a group of men in the Palmarian Catholic Church, that's called in Palmara, Spain, who subsequently came to be known were a group of homosexuals. And and through that ordination, the apostolic, the consecration of bishops passed to many other groups through so-called tuck line. And though the Congregation of for the Doctrine of Faith said it has no canonical validity, they didn't deny the sacramental validity. So I don't think anyone questions the sacramental validity in that line, as long as the sacraments are done. It's not like Pulvermarker, who was elected to be Pope and Bishop when he had no bishop to ordain him. Then there are those who trace orders from the old Catholic Church, like I believe Father Dolan does, and those who trace it through various schismatic bishops of Latin America. And there's just so many of these groups, you'd have to go to Wikipedia's article on Sedevacantism to see the whole lineage. But those are the basic ones.
Yeah. So let's touch on this a little bit more. How did the religious movement? How did the religious movement become so popular and hoodwink so many?
Okay, so I think it's fair to say Sedevacantism is a religious movement, more a movement than religious. But as a category, as a species, you'd have to say it's a religious movement. The average Catholic knows that he should go to Mass on Sunday and keep the faith and practice the normal and basic things of Christian life. But he's not trained in canon law or theology. So when great scandal happens in the church, it's not infrequent throughout the centuries that some faithful break from the person causing a scandal, whether it's the bishop or even a pope. And there's nothing that guarantees the pope is not a sinner, okay? But the reason why we give our allegiance to Christ through the pope and through the bishops is not because the pope and the bishops are saintly men, okay? This is an important point, okay? It's because Christ gave them authority, okay? It's not because they are worthy to exercise that authority. If we fall into the principle, if he's worthy to exercise authority, I'll obey him, then we are replacing the Christian notion of obedience with one that's political, in the sense of, if I don't like the governor of Kansas, I'm not going to obey him. I don't think anyone would say that, because he would know that the police will arrest you whether you think he's the governor or not if you violate his law. And the same thing in the Catholic Church. The angels of God will send you to hell whether you think the Pope is the Pope or not the Pope. Okay, you have to follow the laws of Christ, Roman Pontiff. So Sedevacantism, I would say, I'll be generous and say I think they have good intentions, in the sense of they want to preserve the faith, they want to be faithful to Jesus Christ. They, excuse me, there's a mosquito in the room here. But they fail in this, that it's a very subtle trick of the devil. We cannot be saved without following the laws of the church, because that's how we show our obedience to Jesus Christ. You have to keep the precepts of the church, which is following the laws of the church. So if you don't think the bishop is a bishop anymore, or the pope's a pope anymore because he's a heretic or a schismatic or idolater, the correct response is to go to the laws of the church and see what is the legal process to bring about his repentance or expel him from the church, okay? So in the church, for certain sins, such as heresy, schism, and apostasy, the church has always imposed that that person is immediately excommunicated, in the sense of they're no longer members of the church. However, the church has always required a legal process to determine that, okay? Because who's to say it has happened unless we, in a public legal process, determine it. Now, that doesn't mean the public legal process makes the person a heretic, apostate. No, it just discovers and identifies that it is, okay? So everyone has rights. Everyone's presumed innocent before the law. There's a general principle in Western civilization, and even in the church. So Sedevacantists don't accept that. They don't believe that everyone is innocent before the law. They believe that it's sufficient for them to accuse someone of being a heretic, and that person no longer has any legal rights to be defended in ecclesiastic court, no longer has any canons that you can cite in his favor, and everyone must begin to disobey him because a Sedevacantist accused him of being a heretic. That's not a Catholic principle. That's actually a Calvinist principle. That's what the Calvinists did. They said, oh, your clergy is corrupt, therefore we're not going to obey you. A concept of Calvinism goes into the French Revolution and into all the wars of the Huguenots in France, and it found the foundation of the Presbyterian movement in Scotland. It's just an act of satanic rebellion, because basically what it is I am setting myself up as Pope to determine who is Pope and who is not Pope, because I am infallible in my decisions and I have all authority to make decisions. Well, the only one who is infallible in all his decisions and has authority to make all his decisions is Jesus Christ. And you, Catholic that you are not Jesus Christ. And if you think you are Jesus Christ, there's something deeply wrong with your head, okay? We don't even get a discussion of heretic, because that's just psychotic. So you shouldn't be surprised in many of these groups we find endemic corruption, like the founder of that group up there in Washington State. 20 years passed, and 4 of his seminarians accused him of sexually abusing him. So the first sedevacantist in the United States turns out to have been a pedophile. So people should open their eyes. That's not a coincidence. Now, the Society of St. Pius X doesn't follow canon law on many things too. They're not sedevacantists, but this spring here in the United States, a lot of reports came out showing that they have serious problems with pedophilia in their organization too. So these things are not unrelated, because as Catholics, we can only be saved by following the laws of God and the laws of the church. If we abandon the principle that we must obey law, then we become lawless. And lawless is, the Greek word for lawlessness is sinfulness, okay? So if we want to save our souls, we can't commit mortal sin, and we'll go to hell. And God's going to judge us whether we keep the laws, not only his laws, but the church's laws. So law is a very important criteria in the church. We are not anomians like many Protestants who believe that once you have faith, you don't have to keep any law because you are a law unto yourself. That's satanic, diabolical. But it's a big temptation, because, you know, it's a lot easier to say, I don't like him anymore. I'm not going to listen to him. Therefore, he's no longer even Pope. I'm going to do as I please. Now, it's quite different from a Catholic to say, I think John Paul II, what he did at Assisi is nuts. He shouldn't have done it. And so I'm not going to read any of his encyclicals, okay? Because I'm going to waste my time reading gobbledygook from a mind that would do something like that. But you still recognize he's the Pope, just not, you know, doesn't have it right. His mind is a very confused person, okay? And there's others who will defend what John Paul wanted to do and say that what happened is not what he intended. He was deceived by others. You know, but to say someone's not the Pope merely because you don't like him or your personal judgment without any reference to the Code of Canon Law or legal processes is just not right. It's not Christian and it's not Catholic. So it's a big temptation. Sedevacantists are really liberals. Sedevacantists, in everything they do, seem to be very conservative, very, you might say, right-wing. They do everything in Latin. They have all the lace. They have the incense. They have all the pictures of Our Lady. They'll teach you the Catechism of the Council of Trent and Catechism of St. Pius X. There won't be a dogmatic error that they teach you, pretty much. But they're liberals because they will not teach you that you must keep the laws of the church to save your soul. That's the one thing they won't teach you. And that one thing that they deny is sufficient to send you to hell, because that is a lie. All the devils agree with the thesis, you don't have to follow divine laws for your salvation. That's the whole essence of Satan's rebellion against God. So it's satanic in inspiration. And it's not infrequent that you find, and I've had many friends, benefactors, who become sedevacantists. They start by criticizing it, then they fall into rash judgment, then they get excessively angry, then they get possessed by a spirit of just absolute anger. You can't discuss anything with them anymore. They start screaming at you, calling you a heretic, and blah, 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 blah. And you see, as the years pass, they become like devils. They lose their mind. Some of them burn out and change their ways and come back, but once you abandon the idea that you must keep the law, then you fall into what's called psychopathy or sociopathy, because that is when the conscience no longer recognizes an objective law it must observe. And that's psychologically unhealthy and dangerous, okay? And can destroy you, your family, and everyone around you. So a Catholic has to remain humble. We may not like a pope, but unless he does something that the law says merits a certain punishment, and that the law says a certain legal process has arrived and determined he's no longer the Pope, we must hold that, though we may not think he's the Pope because he's a heretic, that nevertheless he is still the Pope according to the norm of law. I mean, everyone has a right to process it. So it's different from the case of Bergoglio, because that regards the renunciation of Benedict. But even there, I would strongly disagree with anyone who said that Benedict is still the Pope because I like him, or because I want it to be so, or because I think something happened that for which there's no evidence. Okay, you have to base it on a strict legal argument. Okay, and that's why many people fall into Sedevacantism. It presents the Catholic faith pretty much the way it should be, but it just at the price of disobedience to God's laws and the church's laws. And that at that price, you lose your own soul.
What are some famous Sedevacantist groups?
So the famous Sedevacantist groups, a number of them, I might as well go through them because you're going to hear their name. Society St. Pius V. So this was formed by the group of priests who left the Society St. Pius X. And I guess they like the name, so they just changed the number. St. Pius V was a great pope. He called for the Holy League in 1571 that won the Battle of Lepanto, a Dominican, a great saint. And then there's the Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen out of Omaha, Nebraska, and Spokane, Washington. They were founded by that individual I mentioned that turned out later to be a pedophile. Then there's the Institute of Our Lady of Good Counsel, Monte Bona Consiglio, here in Italy, which is inspired by the Father de Lorient's opinion of Sedevacantism. There's the group founded by called Catholic Restoration, led by Bishop Donald Sanborn, Bishop Daniel Dolan, and Father Cicada. Then there's the Roman Catholic Institute, founded by Bishop Sanborn. Then there's different bishops of the tuck lines, some who are still Sedevacantists, some that aren't, mostly that they accept ordination from in that line of episcopal lineage because they're Sedevacantists, or they are Sedevacantists, so as to accept it. There's the Most Holy Family Monastery out of Fillmore, New York, led by Frederick Diamond, who calls himself Michael Diamond, and he is highly funded. He began his career with another group, and at the dissolution of that group, he took the printing press. Some say he stole it. He moved it to a different address, and he just prints out tons of stuff. And he is really notorious for taking words out of context to accuse anyone of being a heretic, just so he can bring in more money. Then there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church. I think they're the ones that call themselves the Byzantine Catholic Patriarchate. Okay, not quite sure. That's a group here in Rome. This other group, I'm not quite sure who they are. And so there's a whole bunch of these groups, and some are in communion with one another, others are not in communion with one another. Do they have valid sacraments? I think nearly all of them have valid sacraments. There might be some doubts in certain lines of the Thuck lines, or maybe the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because I think, well, at least this group, the Byzantine Catholic Patriarchate, there's some doubt of their ordination as bishops, because they trace it back to an atheist who was ordained a bishop in secret during the communist years of Czechoslovakia, and he never was a believer in Christianity, so there's some doubt he could validly ordain anyone. But so those are the main groups. There's lots of them around, and if you go to tradition.com, I think it is, it's a website, you can find a list to Latin masses around the world there. And he'll list, in that list, he will list who says the mass at each group, and you'll see Society St. Pius V or CMI. It'll tell you what group runs that chapel. So you have one of these groups right down the road from you, don't you, AJ?
Yeah. CMRI. Who are they?
They're a group devoted to Our Lady. They founded themselves in Spokane, Washington. They bought like 2.34 square miles of property. They set themselves up in a former Mont St. Michael's Jesuit, I don't know, novitiate or something like that. They're very devoted to Our Lady and her message at Fatima. And they have their own nuns and brothers, and they have a seminary. They've sent missionaries around the world, even to the Holy Land. And they're a rather good organization. I can't personally say anything about them because I've never met any member of their group, never seen any of their chapels in person to know what they are, how they do what they do, or whether they say the 48 liturgy or the 58 liturgy or the 25 liturgy, you know, what years. I mean, by those numbers, I mean which years they were promulgated in.
Yeah. You're watching and listening to Ordo Militaris Radio TV. Visit ordo-militaris.net to support us and listen to our station. Why do so many Catholics say they are faithful but go and support these groups?
I think because a lot of Catholics don't know their faith well enough, so they think that it's sufficient that I keep up the external appearances of religion to be a faithful Catholic, or that it's sufficient that I do something, I associate myself with those who in near 99% agree with the Catholic faith, and if they disagree on 1%, well, you know, it's an understandable position, because if you're opening the paper every day and you see the Pope's, 65% of what he says is Catholic and 35% is not, and when you meet a group of Catholics who's 99% of what is Catholic and only 1% is not, it's a big temptation to say, okay, I'm going to throw my lot in with you. Okay. But we shouldn't throw our lot into either group. We should remain 100% faithful to Jesus Christ. And I think what is really frustrating to a lot of Catholics is we live in an age where the bishops don't do anything about the church. The one bishop in Diocese A that borders Diocese B, bishop in Diocese B will say something heretical, and Bishop A will keep his mouth shut. Whereas throughout the ages, bishop in Diocese A would be, retract that immediately, I'm going to excommunicate you. Okay, so we don't have bishops that have any sense of responsibility for the church, no desire to keep scandal from spreading, and no zeal for the salvation of their own brother bishops. And that frustrates a lot of people, because the silence is as if consent to all these things going on as being right when they're wrong. So there's a lot of frustration in it. That's understanding. I think any Catholic who, once he gets to know all the problems in the church, there's always a temptation, Sedevacantism promotes a temptation, but it's just so irrational on its principle that because there's problems in the church, I can rebel from church law. That's not a traditionalist argument. That's not an integralist argument. That's not a Catholic argument. It's not even a sane argument. And if your parents raised you right, you know that laws are laws, whether people obey them or not. Okay, they're not just suggestions. They're not just customs. It doesn't make sense to follow the rubrics of the Mass and not follow the Code of Canon Law. That's like straining gnats and swallowing camels. Okay, the Code of Canon Law is the camel, and the rubrics of the Mass are like the gnats. I'm not saying you shouldn't follow the rubrics of the Mass. You should, but you should bestly follow the Code of Canon Law. I mean, it's like Jesus Christ. What example he gave us? Jesus Christ observed all the Mosaic law. He never violated the Mosaic law. Okay, so, but he understood what it allowed and what it didn't allow. He allowed his apostles to take some grains off the wheat as they passed through a field on a Saturday, because they were hungry and had nothing to eat, because they lived by begging, because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And starvation was a reason to not observe the Mosaic law of not harvesting on the Sabbath. So our Lord had a very legal mind, and he was a legal expert. As God obviously has a legal mind, because God is law by his very nature, his being is law. So both as God and man, he's a legal expert. And he didn't found a religion to have no laws, quite the contrary. Now, that doesn't mean that if we keep all the external laws, we're holy, because God's laws also guard our mind and our heart and how we live in the sight of God, where he alone is the witness of our observance. So we have to observe all God's laws. And when you observe God's laws, you'll find peace, because you'll know that you are faithful to the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Whereas if you just want a religion of appearances, well, you can do that in any fake church. Why go to a Sedevacantist church and do that? Now, at the same time, if the parish in your town is heretical and immoral, then you're not obliged to go that. One thing that Catholics have to understand is the obligation of going to Mass on Sunday only exists when there is a Catholic Mass in communion with the Pope, and the priest is not a heretic, and the congregation is not an occasion of sin for you. If there was a parish down the street and everyone was perfectly Catholic and in communion with the true Pope, and the liturgy was the right liturgy, but the women didn't wear clothing, well, then you're obliged not to go to that church for Mass, because it would be an occasion of sin for anyone, just indecent. So the obligation to go to Mass on Sunday is not a strict, unchanging, eternal obligation. It's a relative obligation based on whether you can save your soul by going to that church. Okay. If a person was being persecuted, let's say you were a young person and the priest in your parish had raped you, well, you no longer have an obligation to go to church at that parish, even if it's the only parish in 1,000 miles, and you're not committing a sin, because it would be a danger for you to go there. Okay. So the obligation of Sunday Mass isn't so extreme that we have to run off to some schismatic group, Sedevacantist group, some crazy group that's not authorized, and attend Mass there because it gives us a nice feeling. It looks like a Catholic ceremony. It reminds me of my grandmother's religion or something of that sort. Okay. Those are, nice things, but that's not the substance of Christian obedience when it comes to the worship of God. And the worship of God on Sunday at Mass is, as I said, not an absolute obligation. It only exists when the opportunity presents itself. And the duty to present that opportunity comes from the clergy. Okay, they're the ones who are supposed to bring you to Mass. You don't have to travel 10 hours to get to the Mass. If you do so, God bless you, but you're not obliged to do so. Okay, so.
Now let's touch on, what do these Sedevacantists believe?
In matters of dogma and doctrine and faith and morality, as far as I know, they all believe the Catholic faith. That's why some people say they're not Catholics, and some people say almost they're schismatics. I think the more accurate to say that formally they're schismatic, or that they don't intend to be so. Okay, because they're not in communion with the true Pope. But nearly all of them are experts at manipulating facts to make it appear that what they're doing is right. They'll have, first of all, they'll choose the arguments to talk with you about. They'll come as like Jehovah's Witnesses. They will never let you start the conversation and choose the topics, and then you go right to the heart of the matter, and they'll admit that they don't follow the laws of the church. And they'll think that that's okay. And so they'll begin with, they'll say, the sacraments in your church aren't valid, or your matrimony is not valid. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses will come to the door of widows and say, do you know that your husband who died last week went to hell because he wasn't a Jehovah's Witness? So they try these kind of psychological manipulations. They try to bring people down. They try to instill in them doubt. They do a lot of very wicked things to seduce people into their sin. And so that's the most detestable thing about them. It'd be one thing if a person personally had the opinion, and was a Sedevacantist. But when you go start preaching your error, then you're doing something diabolical. Okay, so by false arguments. Okay, I'll just use an example. So from Rome.info, where I'm the editor, I have a handbook explaining why Pope Benedict is the Pope. But if you read that from the beginning to end, I always say, don't exploit the situation. Don't surprise a person. Appeal to facts and reason. Don't get into arguments. Let them decide when to speak with you and where to speak with you. Why? Because truth convinces of itself. There's no need to manipulate people, twist the arguments, or change things. Okay? Just state the facts for what they are. And if Sedevacantism was true, that's what they would do. But as I said, Christ founded a church with laws and authority, and the church has courts, and everyone has rights, and canon law says what those are. But the Sedevacantists won't accept any of that, and groups that don't accept that are often the breeding ground of Sedevacantism, like the Society of St. Pius V comes from the Society of St. Pius X. And so that's why it's easy that's what they believe, that's what it's easy to fall into them. So when you're talking to Sedevacantists, you have to bring the topic always back A Catholic's duty is to keep canon law, because Christ said of St. Peter, whatsoever you bound on earth shall be bound in heaven. So you can't get to heaven unless you observe what is bound in heaven. And what is bound in heaven includes also what Peter bound on earth, and that's canon law. So if you don't observe canon law, don't presume you're getting to heaven. Okay? Now I can say I'm a simple, uneducated layman. He doesn't understand these things, you know. Okay. But someone who's a priest or who gets ordained as a bishop and has studied these things, go around pretending that this is not the truth and not the Catholic faith, is not going to have any excuse before God, because he's involved in manifest, public, intentional, pertinacious disagreement with God in the matter of things necessary for salvation.
Why won't Sedevacantists accept canon law?
Because it demolishes the whole thing. So in canon law, as I said, if the Pope is a heretic, you write bishops, you write cardinals, you lobby them to correct the Pope and give him occasion to repent of his sin, okay? And if he doesn't, you call an imperfect synod, imperfect council, it's called imperfect because the Pope doesn't call it, and you declare that the facts are that he committed this sin, crime, or delict, and that he's impenitent, and therefore he's no longer a member of the church, because it's impossible to be a member of church when you do things like that. So that's the way to go. You'll never see a Sedevacantist mobilizing to save the church, because they're not about saving the church. They're about creating their own little cult that they reign over, which is exactly what a devil does. That's the whole philosophy of business of a devil. Create your own little kingdom and rule over it and make everyone a slave to you in it. That's what the Catholic view is. There's a problem in the church, like Catherine of Siena. She writes the Pope, she writes cardinals. You seek the salvation of the whole church, and you dedicate your life to that. That's the Catholic approach.
Okay. How to help restore those who left the church back to the church from Sedevacantism?
We have to convince them that they of the words of our Lord. We have to call them back to faith in Jesus Christ. His words to Peter, whatever you bound on earth shall be bound in heaven. Okay. We have to get them to recognize the principles of natural justice, that everyone has a right to a trial. Everyone is presumed innocent before the law. No one can usurp the authority of prosecutor and judge and jury all to himself. That's just not rational, okay? No one, that's just not, sane. That's just not just. So I think on those 2 points, if a Sedevacantist will hear you, you might be able to extract him from the cult. The hardest thing is they're going to say, well, then I'll have nowhere I can go to Mass, okay? But this is where Christianity is different from Pharisaism. Christianity doesn't consist in external practices of religion as an absolute principle, okay? So for the Catholic on a little island in the South Pacific where there's no priest in 200 miles, he is not less a Catholic because he doesn't go to Mass than someone in the city of Rome who goes to Mass, 5 times a day. And okay, that's because your external practices is not what principally makes you a Catholic. It's fidelity to God according to your duties. So obviously, one in the South Pacific Island can't get to Mass. He's not failing God by not going to Mass. And he doesn't have to take out a missal on Sundays and read the Mass out loud, as many priests of the Society of St. Pius X teach. That's just, in my opinion, absurd, especially if you're reading the words that the priest says, because the Mass is not an absolute obligation. Say the Rosary, do an hour of meditation. Read the Bible, read the lives of the saints or the doctors or the fathers of the church. That's what you should do instead. But you're not obliged to read the text of the Mass, because the text of the Mass is not meant to fulfill of itself to be some kind of magical formula that if you read it, you fulfill your Sunday obligation. And you don't have a Sunday obligation if there's no Mass. So that's just, super philosophy. And it's really also slightly wrong. No one should say the words of a priest unless he's a priest celebrating Mass.
Any other items to cover regarding Sedevacantism?
Yeah, beware of them on the internet. They are, they target people to break them down, okay? They'll start talking to you, and then they'll get more of their friends to talk to you, and they're like Jehovah's Witnesses. They pile it on until they can bring you down. And they've targeted people, they target famous public speakers and anyone who has a following, because they're out to get your followers to become members of their little church. So they are devious, they're diabolic, they're insidious, they're dishonest, okay? And I can say I've been on the internet since 1991, 1989. So I've seen many of them, and they try it with me. And I am on the blacklist of blacklists for Sedes, because they know that they've never defeated Bugnolo in an argument, and I always expose them for what they are. So they don't want any of their followers to talk to me, because I can untalk them out of all their errors. But you have to be firm with them and catch them for what they are. That's why it's important to know what a Sedevacanti is and how to defend yourself from it. And I'm very glad, AJ, that on Ordo Militaris Radio TV, you've asked me to do this show with you.
Yep. This is Ordo Militaris Radio TV doing this important show. If you like what we do, like what we say on the radio, please support us at ordo-militaris.net. There's a click any of the radio posts. You'll see at the bottom where you can make a monthly donation. Please do so. And thank you for watching, and thank you, Brother Alexis, for coming on.
My pleasure.
And this is Ordo Militaris Radio TV, signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.